Under the immaculate blue sky of an upscale suburban enclave nestled between rolling hills and white-fenced cul-de-sacs, the Brown family had just begun what they hoped would be a quiet, restorative chapter of their lives. The house was pristine, modern yet warm, with tall windows and a wide, open backyard that caught the golden hour light like a postcard. Michael Brown, a logistics consultant who worked remotely, had chosen this neighborhood for its proximity to nothing important, and that was exactly the point. For years, his wife Avery had chased intensity, professionally, emotionally, even intellectually. She wasn't loud about it, but there was a steeliness behind her smile and a precision in everything she did that made people instinctively know she was not to be underestimated. While Michael settled into his home office with quiet contentment, Avery turned her attention to the overgrown and underutilized backyard. Most new homeowners might have installed a pool, a deck, maybe a few raised garden beds from a weekend big box trip. Avery did none of that. Instead, she mapped the yard with the quiet obsession of a cartographer. She installed long, curving planting rows that followed no obvious pattern, and instead of hydrangeas and marigolds, she brought in seeds from obscure nurseries abroad. Seeds that arrived in tightly packed paper envelopes labeled with symbols no one could decipher. She built trellises out of reclaimed aircraft-grade aluminum and constructed a custom irrigation system that didn't connect to the neighborhood's lines. Over time, unusual flora took root. Velvet, textured vines that curled clockwise against gravity, clusters of thick-stemmed purple shrubs with leaves that emitted a clean, camphorous scent that lingered on clothing for hours. The other residents noticed, of course. The neighborhood, regulated by an aggressive homeowners association, was proud of its uniformity. Lawns were to be kept below 3.5 inches. Solar panels required prior approval, and fences could be no higher than 4 feet. So, naturally, Avery's garden, with its semi-industrial structures and botanical oddities, began to draw attention. Most of the neighbors observed in polite silence, exchanging concerned glances during evening walks or murmuring to each other at mailbox clusters. But Karen Grace, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, was not the type to observe silently. Karen had the kind of smile that tightened before it curved, the sort of voice that insisted rather than requested, and a particular obsession with compliance. It wasn't personal, she claimed, not in the beginning. But the moment she laid eyes on Avery's garden, she saw it as a threat, not just to bylaws and uniformity, but to her own unspoken authority. Karen approached the situation as she always did, with a clipboard, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and an escalating paper trail of notices. The first was mild, a suggestion that recent changes to landscaping may require review. The second was firmer, citing sections and subclauses, and the third carried the HOA logo in bold, warning of potential noncompliance requiring correction. Avery read each notice, then set them aside without comment. She never retaliated, never confronted. She simply continued planting. And each week, her garden evolved, not chaotically but deliberately, as if she were building something that only she could see the shape of. Michael, for his part, trusted her. He asked few questions, understanding that whatever Avery was doing in the backyard wasn't merely hobbyist enthusiasm. She worked with surgical focus, and her mood remained calm, balanced, almost serene. Occasionally, she'd return from the garden with dirt under her nails and make herself a cup of green tea while staring out the kitchen window, watching the wind pass through the tall, swaying stalks. Once, Michael joked that it looked more like a science lab than a backyard. Avery only smiled and replied, "It's better than therapy." But Karen wasn't amused. She started photographing the yard from the sidewalk, muttering about exotic vegetation and unregistered modifications. She called a special HOA meeting to discuss emerging risks to neighborhood cohesion. She sent Avery an invitation with a hand-scribbled note, We'd appreciate your perspective." Avery did not attend, nor did she respond when Karen left laminated copies of neighborhood design guidelines on their porch. For Karen, this silence was the ultimate provocation. Something about Avery's composed indifference chipped at her control, and what began as regulatory oversight began to twist into personal fixation. And yet, Avery remained unmoved, rooted in the calm precision of her work. She wasn't hiding. She was simply uninterested in explaining. But by the time the first incident occurred, the roots of confrontation had already taken hold, deep, tangled, and waiting to surface. Karen Grace had always believed in process. Formal channels, paper trails, documented complaints filed in triplicate. But the more she watched Avery work in her strange and evolving garden, the more that belief began to erode into something more primitive. Suspicion that pulsed beneath the surface like an itch she couldn't scratch. She tried to reason with herself at first. Maybe the woman was just eccentric. Maybe she was experimenting with some kind of obscure organic farming method. But the shapes of those plants, the stark, unnatural colors, the silent presence Avery carried when she moved through the foliage like she belonged more to the greenery than the neighborhood, none of it felt right. What finally pushed Karen from discomfort to action was the capsule. It was a warm Saturday morning, the kind where most of the neighborhood was out washing cars, trimming hedges, or waving to each other over low fences. Karen had taken to walking past the Browns' property with increasing frequency, always under the pretense of checking on the community bulletin board a few houses down. She didn't stop. She didn't stare. She just timed her steps so she could look at the garden without seeming to. But this time she saw something she couldn't unsee. Avery was crouched in the soil near the back corner of the yard, half hidden by thick, spiral-stemmed plants that glistened unnaturally in the sun. She held what looked like a metal capsule. Smooth, silver, the size of a thick thermos, with a narrow ridge running around its center and a small red light blinking near the cap. Avery tapped the capsule lightly against her knee as if thinking, then calmly dug a hole in the dirt and buried it. She didn't rush. She didn't look around. It was as though she didn't care who might see. And maybe she didn't. That was the part that unsettled Karen most. She didn't sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that capsule. What was in it? Chemicals? Surveillance equipment? Something biological? Her mind looped through possibilities, none of them benign. At 2 a.m, she went to her home office and opened the HOA protocol binder. Section 9.14 covered unapproved installations of underground equipment or storage vessels. Technically, it applied to septic tanks and irrigation valves. But she could stretch the interpretation. She highlighted the clause and made a note to include it in a formal incident report. By Monday, the report was on the HOA's docket, and Karen had already requested a visit from a code enforcement officer. But the appointment was mysteriously delayed, pushed out without explanation. Frustrated, she called the city's environmental safety line and left a message about possible chemical hazards being introduced via soil contamination on residential property. She didn't use Avery's name, not directly, but she used her address. Still, no one called back. No follow-up email. Just silence. The next day, her mail included a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed in the small serif font. Sometimes it's better not to dig. No signature, no context. Karen froze, then scanned her front porch, her driveway, the street. Everything looked normal, but her skin crawled. She wasn't a paranoid woman, at least she never used to be, but something about this entire situation made her feel watched. Like she had stepped into a game she didn't understand. Nevertheless, she doubled down. She organized a spontaneous HOA compliance walkthrough, citing growing community concerns. She brought 2 board members with her, neither enthusiastic but both too polite to refuse. They walked the neighborhood with clipboards, inspecting fences and porch lights, then stopped at the Browns' house. Avery was outside, gently rubbing the leaves of one of her flowering vines with gloved fingers. She looked up and offered a calm, neutral smile. Karen held hers just as tightly. "We're conducting a visual assessment," Karen said, loud enough for the clipboard to hear, "for record keeping." Avery nodded once, returned to her plant, and said nothing. Karen's eyes locked onto the corner of the yard where the capsule had been buried. The soil was undisturbed, completely flat, as if no one had touched it in weeks. No displaced earth, no markers, just perfect, compact ground. Karen stepped closer. "I'll need to document possible subsoil installations," she said. "Your yard may require an environmental scan." Avery looked up, still serene. "This garden isn't under your jurisdiction," she said softly. Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" "You don't have the authority to inspect it." The way she said it, without challenge, without emotion, felt like a closed door, as though she were simply stating a fact about physics or time. Karen's breath caught in her throat. "You don't decide that," she snapped. But Avery just stood, pulled off her gloves, and turned away. She didn't even bother to go inside, just walked toward the rear fence and disappeared behind a thick curtain of green. That night, Karen wrote the most aggressive HOA complaint she'd ever submitted in her life. She referenced bylaws, environmental risk, community image, and structural safety. She requested emergency review, but when she hit send, the email bounced. Not delayed, not flagged, just vanished with an error she'd never seen before. She tried again from her phone, same result. She tried from the HOA's internal platform, access denied. She drove to the HOA office the next morning to hand-deliver the report, but the building was locked. A note on the door said, "Temporarily closed, system update." Her phone buzzed with an automated HOA message. "Routine maintenance in progress. No meetings or filings until further notice." Karen didn't believe in coincidences, especially not digital ones. Fueled by a growing sense of helplessness, she returned home, walked into her backyard, and stared across the narrow alley that separated her lot from the Browns. Her fingers gripped the fence. She thought about what she saw buried, what might be growing there now, unseen. Her heart thudded in her ears. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was happening. And if no one else would deal with it, she would, even if it meant crossing a line, even if it meant doing something stupid. The next day, just after noon, she stood at the edge of Avery's garden. Avery wasn't in sight. The plants rustled gently in the breeze, casting soft shadows like fingers stretching toward her. Karen stepped onto the grass, her breath short. She walked across the yard, found the corner where she'd seen the capsule go into the ground, and knelt. The soil was firm, but not impenetrable. She pulled a small trowel from her coat pocket and began to dig. It was shallow at first, just a few inches, but soon she hit something solid. She scraped away more dirt. There it was, smooth, silver. The capsule. Suddenly, there was movement behind her, a sharp sound, feet against stone. She turned and saw Avery standing silently near the back door. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. Karen stood, heart pounding. "This needs to be reported," Karen said, holding the trowel like a badge. "This isn't standard gardening equipment." Avery stepped closer. "Put that back." Karen took a step back. "I don't think so." Then, in a moment that would later play like a hallucination in her memory, Avery lifted her hand, not threateningly, just as if reaching out. Karen panicked. The trowel clattered to the ground. She fumbled into her coat pocket and pulled out the small pink personal taser she kept for emergencies. Before she could think, before she could process anything, she fired. The crackle of electricity hit air. Avery flinched. Karen didn't know where it landed. All she knew was the sound, the awful, rising chorus of voltage and breath. Then, silence. Avery dropped to one knee, not in pain, but in measured effort, like a gymnast composing herself. She looked up, and in that moment Karen realized she'd made a mistake far more severe than any HOA infraction. The silence after the incident felt louder than the crackle of the taser itself. Karen stood frozen, arms still extended, eyes locked onto Avery, who remained crouched, one knee in the soil, her face blank and unreadable. It was not the expression of someone hurt or shocked or even angry. It was colder than that, a kind of studied neutrality that unsettled Karen in ways she couldn't explain. For a second, Karen thought she had paralyzed her. But then Avery stood up, slowly, with composure. Her jacket had a small burn mark near the rib cage where the taser had struck, but otherwise she was untouched. No scream, no collapse, no appeal for help. She simply brushed dirt from her hands, adjusted her sleeve, and turned toward the house without a word. Karen felt her knees weaken. "Wait," Karen said, unsure why she was even speaking. She wasn't trying to apologize. Not yet. You're hiding something here. I had no choice. I was defending myself." But Avery didn't turn around. She walked through the back door and closed it quietly behind her. The sound of that door clicking shut, quiet, deliberate, was far more terrifying than any shout could have been. Karen stood alone in the garden for what felt like hours, the capsule still half buried, the trowel by her feet, her taser hanging limp in her hand. When she finally backed away, retreating toward her side of the fence, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only dread. She wasn't sure what would happen next. A call to the police? A lawsuit? Public humiliation? But none of that came. Instead, the neighborhood went eerily still. That night, she checked her email compulsively, waiting for a notice from Avery or Michael or even the HOA's legal department. Nothing. She opened the HOA admin portal. Her credentials were no longer valid. The screen blinked twice, then refreshed with a blank white page. She tried calling Marcus, one of the board members who'd accompanied her on the last walkthrough. No answer. Voicemail full. She left a terse message asking if he'd heard anything from the Browns. No reply. By morning, Karen felt sick with uncertainty. She half expected sirens at her door, or at least a knock from Avery with a clipboard and a lawyer. But when she looked out her window, the Browns' home looked perfectly normal. Michael was drinking coffee on the porch reading a tablet. Avery wasn't in sight. The garden looked untouched. The capsule, if it was ever there, was gone. Then came the envelope. It was delivered without a stamp, just left in Karen's mailbox sometime between sunrise and 10 a.m. Cream-colored paper, no return address. Inside, a single business card, dark gray with an embossed logo she didn't recognize, 3 interlocking leaves forming a spiral, and a message written in the same serif font as the last anonymous note: "You've been observed. Do not interfere again." Karen's throat went dry. Her first thought was to drive to the police station. But something inside her, maybe fear, maybe something more primal, told her not to. The taser incident wasn't just a misstep. She had crossed a line, and whatever lay beyond it didn't follow the rules she was used to. Her phone rang. Unknown caller. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Grace," said a smooth male voice. "You'll want to be more careful where you walk." The line went dead. Karen gripped the phone so hard it creaked. She stared out her window again. The neighborhood had become unfamiliar. What had once felt orderly and manageable now pulsed with threat. She stepped outside, hoping to clear her head. Maybe it was all a bluff. Maybe Avery had friends in high places, but at the end of the day, Karen was still president of the HOA. She had rights, power, influence. That illusion shattered the moment she walked to her car, It was parked in her driveway, as usual. But the windshield had been neatly cleaned, more than she ever cleaned it, and inside, placed perfectly on the dashboard, was her taser. Not the one from her drawer, the one she'd fired into Avery's side. She never brought it back from the yard. She didn't even know where she'd dropped it. She snatched it from the car and immediately dialed the Browns' number. No answer. She rang their doorbell. Nothing. She pounded once, twice. Michael eventually opened the door with a puzzled look. "I need to speak to Avery," she said, voice shaking. "She's busy," Michael replied, calm, even friendly. "Can I take a message?" Karen stared at him. Tell her I returned it." Michael looked down, noticed the taser in her hand, and nodded once, slowly. "I'll let her know." The door closed again. Karen stumbled back across the lawn, unsure how she'd even gotten through that conversation. Every instinct screamed that something deeper was happening here, something far outside the realm of HOA disputes and landscaping violations. That evening, she tried contacting the city council anonymously, reporting potential zoning violations and unauthorized plant research. She was rerouted 6 times before landing on a voicemail line that gave no name. She left a message. The next day, her internet went out. Then her phone. Then the lights in her kitchen began flickering at random times. She called a technician. The technician never showed. When she tried to escalate the issue with the HOA's Regional Oversight Office, she was informed, politely but with finality, that her local board had been dissolved for structural redundancy, and that all prior complaints were now sealed for audit. No timeline, no explanation. On the 3rd day, her recycling bin was taken away and never returned. Her mailbox was replaced with a standard-issue steel box welded shut. She received no mail, no calls. Her power returned, but her security system now played soft static whenever she tried to access the recordings. Karen was being isolated. Her name began to fade from community documents. She noticed that the HOA newsletter no longer included her monthly column. A neighbor she knew for 5 years pretended not to recognize her at the grocery store. Her own digital footprint began to shrink. Archived minutes from meetings she'd chaired disappeared. Pictures of her from block parties vanished from the HOA's website. It was as if she were being rewritten out of her own neighborhood. And through it all, Avery remained absent. One morning, desperate and shaken, Karen crossed the street and stood again at the edge of the Browns' property. She didn't step onto the grass. She just stood there, like a trespasser debating their crime. The garden looked taller now, denser. Some of the plants had grown thin, silver tendrils that caught the morning light and shimmered like threads of glass. Michael came out again, coffee in hand. "Looking for something?" he asked. Karen blinked. "Is Avery here?" "She's resting," he said. "You should be too." Then, as if remembering something, he added, "We're not enemies, Karen. We just like peace." Karen didn't respond. She walked back to her house in a fog. That night, a final envelope arrived. No return address, no letter, just a photo. Karen standing in Avery's garden, taser in hand, capsule at her feet. Taken from above, as if from a drone or rooftop. The timestamp was exactly 12 seconds before she fired, and beneath the photo, handwritten in ink, "Don't reach again." The next morning, Karen placed her resignation letter in a Ziploc bag and taped it to the HOA office door. She didn't expect a reply. Karen had never known how to sit still. Even in silence, she fidgeted. Even in sleep, she dreamed in administrative order. Columns, checklists, dates. It was how she stayed in control, how she held the chaos of real life at bay. But in the days following her resignation, something within her began to unspool in slow, deliberate increments. There were no consequences she could predict, no procedures to follow. Every time she tried to reclaim some piece of her role, by instinct, by reflex, she found that it had been erased, overwritten or replaced. She no longer had access to the HOA's community portal. Her key to the board's meeting room didn't work. Her nameplate had been removed. The file drawer in her office labeled "Compliance Cases" had been emptied. She checked her cloud backups, files corrupted. Even her physical notebooks, once dense with notes and color-coded sticky tabs, had missing pages. Not torn or ripped, just gone, as if they had never existed to begin with. The most recent entry she could find was over 6 months old. Something was rewriting her life in reverse. She found herself retreating indoors, curtains drawn, avoiding neighbors who now barely acknowledged her presence. She hadn't seen Avery since the night she left the Taser on the Browns' porch, but she sometimes sensed movement in their backyard at strange hours. Not light, not noise, just a pulse in the air, a tension in the atmosphere. One evening, she thought she heard something humming from across the alley, like the quiet resonance of a tuning fork buried under dirt. It was barely audible, but it made her fillings ache. By the end of that week, she had stopped sleeping. Her doctor prescribed a mild sedative, which she filled but never took. She didn't trust the pills. She didn't trust the pharmacy. She didn't trust anything anymore. The world had turned pliable, like a curtain billowing over something far larger than her understanding. She needed proof, not speculation, not intuition. She needed something concrete, something she could point to and say, "Here, this is what's wrong." And for that, she would have to go back. She waited until the third night of rain, a long, soaking kind of storm that softened soil and blurred security cameras with streaks of water. Just before 4 a.m., she dressed in black, pulled on her oldest gardening boots, and crept into the Browns' yard. It was more overgrown than she remembered, though not in the messy, neglected way she once would have reported. It was alive with intention. Plants arched toward one another in complex patterns, some braided together at the stems, others forming geometrically impossible spirals. She stepped carefully, but the foliage shifted under her feet like memory foam. It smelled faintly metallic. She made her way to the far corner, the same spot where she'd unearthed the capsule weeks ago. There was no sign of her digging. The ground was perfectly flat. She knelt, scraped at the dirt with her gloved fingers. Nothing. She moved a few feet to the right. Still nothing. But then, beneath a thick tangle of leaves, she found something small, half buried. A coin-sized disc made of brushed steel. No markings, no buttons, but cold to the touch, even in the wet earth. She slipped it into her coat pocket and stood up. The moment she did, the plants around her shifted, just slightly. Not in response to wind, not the way nature moves. It felt synchronized, coordinated. She took one slow step back, then another. No rustling, no alarms, no floodlights. But her heart beat faster. She returned home soaked, mud-splattered and shaking. She placed the disc on her kitchen table and stared at it for hours. It didn't react to heat, light, or pressure, but when she brought her phone near it, the signal dropped to 0. No service, no Wi-Fi. Her digital clock reset. The refrigerator's LED display blinked for an hour afterward. Something in that disc repelled electricity, not magnetically but fundamentally. She thought about bringing it to the authorities, but she already knew they wouldn't find anything. If they could even detect it. If it would still exist by the time she handed it over. Instead, she drove to the university 2 towns over. Not to the administration or security, but to the botanical research wing. Her niece had once studied there, and she remembered how strange and specific their focus had been. Bioelectrical signaling in plants. She slipped in during open lab hours, posing as a visiting alum, and left the disc in a tissue culture tray by the greenhouse entrance. She included no note, just wanted to see if anyone would say anything. A week later, she returned. The tray was gone. When she asked about it casually, the lab technician stared at her for a long time before replying. "We don't grow that kind of thing here." It wasn't an answer. It was a message. She didn't return. And then, one morning, she found an envelope on her porch. It wasn't plain like before. This one was heavier, glossy, sealed with a small red wax stamp bearing the same spiral leaf emblem from the business card. Inside was a folded sheet of a thick parchment with a single sentence. "You were warned not to dig." Beneath it, a second sheet, standard printer paper, showed a satellite image of her home. But not from above. From an angle, high enough to see her back patio, the inside of her living room window, and the exact location where she had set the disc the night she retrieved it. The image was time-stamped for the hour she had stared at it, contemplating her next move. That same afternoon, a truck arrived in her driveway. No markings, just a matte black cab with government plates. A man stepped out, tall, narrow build, dressed like someone trying not to be remembered. No badge, no name. He knocked once. Karen answered. "You've been in proximity to unauthorized materials," he said without preamble. "That puts you in a gray zone. We need you to answer a few questions." She tried to respond, tried to push back, but he raised one hand calmly. "You're not under arrest. You're under observation. That distinction is important." They spoke inside her house for 2 hours. He didn't take notes, didn't record, just asked how she got the disc, what she saw in the garden, what she knew about Avery Brown. When she said she didn't know anything concrete, he smiled just slightly. "Exactly," he said. "Let's keep it that way." Then he left. No warning, no card, just silence again. That night, Karen stood at her window, watching the lights across the street. Avery's garden glowed faintly in the moonlight. Michael was sitting outside, alone. He raised his mug as if in greeting. She didn't return the gesture. Her phone vibrated once on the counter. A message. No number. No sender. Just 2 words. Midpoint reached. And as she stared at it, Karen understood something terrible. Not about Avery, not about the disc, but about herself. She hadn't been dragged into something foreign. She had walked right into it. And now there was no path back. Karen didn't speak to anyone for 3 days after the message arrived. The phrase "midpoint reached" played on a loop in her head, not just as a warning but as a sentence. Final, unnegotiable. She deleted the message, then checked an hour later and found it had returned. Not in the usual inbox, but embedded in her phone's wallpaper, etched faintly in the background of every screen. She reset the device twice. It remained. She changed phones. It transferred. At some point, she stopped trying. Her efforts no longer mattered. That was the quiet horror settling in her chest. Not the fear of surveillance or the creeping sense of being watched, but the knowledge that whatever she'd triggered had already passed the point of intervention. It was happening, and it didn't require her permission. Avery, of course, remained invisible. Michael continued his routine. Coffee in the morning, walks in the evening, the occasional chat with neighbors that seemed more like performances than genuine conversations. The Browns had become central figures in a play that only Karen understood was being staged for someone else entirely. And now the audience was shifting. Not just hidden observers from above or unnamed officials with unreadable expressions, but the neighborhood itself. Karen began noticing small behavioral changes around her. The woman who used to walk her dog at 7:45 sharp every morning now crossed the street to avoid Karen's house without breaking stride. The high school senior who had once offered to mow her lawn now averted his eyes and turned his music up as he passed. Mail stopped arriving altogether. Not even junk. She filed a complaint at the post office. They said her address didn't exist in the current delivery system. She showed them her ID. They apologized, confused, and told her to check with county records. At the county building, the clerk spent 10 minutes searching before politely informing her that the property number had been reassigned. "But I live there," Karen said. "I've lived there for 13 years. "Not according to our system," the clerk replied. "It was recently redesignated as an administrative zone. No resident data is listed." Karen stood there for a long time, trying to decide whether to scream or cry. In the end, she simply turned and walked away. She started documenting everything. Notebooks, audio memos, printed screenshots, but each morning, some of it was gone. Not missing. Gone. Pages she knew she'd written were blank. Recordings erased, photos distorted. Once she found a full notebook she hadn't written in yet, already filled with notes. Only not hers. Not her handwriting. Not her words. Phrases she didn't recognize. Maps of places she'd never been. An entire page covered in symbols that looked like plant root systems mapped against constellations. She couldn't be sure if it was a warning or an instruction. Then, late one night, the sky above her house flickered. Not lightning, not a plane. A flicker like a projector bulb burning out for a fraction of a second. The streetlights went dark. Her house went darker. Her reflection in the kitchen window didn't match her movements. It lagged, only for a second, but it watched her more than mirrored her. She stepped away and didn't return to that side of the house for the rest of the night. The next day, her backyard was different. Nothing obvious, but the grass had changed color, slightly bluer. The fence now had no gate. The stones around her flower bed were laid in a different pattern, spiraling inward where she remembered them running straight. Her garden hose, always curled around its post, was unwound, stretched out across the yard, and resting directly against the Browns' fence line. And the dirt. The dirt was wrong. She scooped some into a plastic sandwich bag and took it to a lab in a nearby town under the pretense of testing for lead. When the results came back, the technician called her personally. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My backyard," she answered. He paused, then said, "This isn't soil. I mean, chemically, it's not consistent with anything I can classify. It has mineral structures I've only seen in experimental simulations. Not in nature. Not even in labs. What does that mean?" "It means your backyard might not be part of this ecosystem anymore." Karen hung up without responding. That night, she watched Avery walk across the garden for the first time in weeks. It was just after 3 a.m. She moved like a dancer through the plants, barefoot, silent. She held something in her hand, long, metallic, smooth like the capsule, but thinner, more like a rod. She touched each major cluster of plants with it. As she moved, the plants changed posture. Leaves curled inward, some emitted a faint bioluminescent pulse. She wasn't tending to them. She was commanding them, and they obeyed. Karen opened her window and whispered, "What are you?" Avery didn't respond, but she looked up, right at her, as if she'd heard every word. The next morning, Karen awoke to find her front door ajar. Inside was a package, wrapped in fabric, no label. She unwrapped it carefully. It was the rod. But this one was cracked down the center, humming faintly as if alive. Along the seam, words had been etched in a language she didn't know, but her brain translated them anyway, not in text, but in feeling. "Return what is not yours." She dropped it. The hum stopped. Later that day, Karen received her first human interaction in weeks. A man in a gray coat knocked once, entered without waiting for permission, and sat at her table. She didn't ask who he was. He didn't say. He just looked at her and said, "You know now." That's the threshold. Threshold of what? "Territory," he said. "Yours isn't yours anymore, but you already knew that." He stood, turned toward the door, then paused. "She doesn't want war," he said, "but she doesn't lose them either." And then he was gone. Karen didn't follow. She walked to her back window and looked out at her yard, and for the first time she realized It wasn't her yard anymore. It hadn't been for a while. She just hadn't noticed how far the roots had already spread. The air changed the morning the trucks came. Not loud, not announced, and not labeled, but felt. Karen heard them before she saw them. A low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the floorboards of her house and settled into the soles of her feet like the dull pressure of a rising tide. She pulled back her curtain and saw 3 identical matte black vehicles parked in the cul-de-sac. Engines running, windows tinted to the point of opacity. No one stepped out. No one moved. But every door in the neighborhood closed in unison, and the silence that followed felt curated, like a soundproof vacuum swallowing the last breath of normalcy. Karen didn't open her door. She stood at the window in her bathrobe, heart hammering against her ribs, watching as 2 of the trucks slowly rolled forward, one toward the Browns' property, one toward hers. The third remained still, positioned directly between the 2 houses like a fulcrum. Then, at last, the doors opened. The men who stepped out weren't soldiers, but they weren't civilians either. They wore identical slate-gray uniforms with no visible insignia, each one moving with practiced efficiency. No communication devices, no weapons visible. They didn't knock. They approached the properties with the same kind of intent Karen had once applied to enforcing neighborhood codes. Only now, that intent had muscle, momentum, and silence behind it. One of them stopped outside Karen's fence, paused, then looked directly into her window. He didn't wave, didn't gesture, just met her eyes and held the gaze as if measuring something only he could see. Then Avery stepped outside. It was the first time Karen had seen her up close in weeks. She wore no shoes, no makeup, no protective gear. Just a long gray coat belted at the waist and that same calm, self-contained focus that had always made her so unnerving. She didn't acknowledge the trucks. She didn't flinch at the presence of the men. Instead, she walked barefoot across her garden, the plants shifting subtly around her feet as if leaning in for contact. The capsule, Karen didn't know if it was the same one or another, was in her hand again. But this time it was open. Something shimmered inside it, not quite a light, not quite a substance, but something in between. She raised it above her head. The men didn't move. But the ground did. Not violently, not an earthquake, but a slow, deliberate undulation, like the entire neighborhood had exhaled. Trees swayed in unison though there was no wind. Grass flattened in a spiral around Avery's garden. From Karen's vantage point, the pattern looked almost like a fingerprint pressed into the earth. She couldn't stop staring, couldn't stop breathing shallow, couldn't stop the feeling that she was watching something both ancient and far ahead of her time. Then Avery turned, not to the men, not to her plants, but to Karen. Her eyes locked onto hers with surgical precision, and in that moment, Karen felt something burn behind her own eyes. Not pain, not fear, memory, too fast, too full. Images that weren't hers. Deserts, labs, tunnels deep underground, languages without sound, maps of root systems extending beneath continents. Organisms communicating through soil. Experiments, surveillance, failures, loss, then, finally, emergence. Not as a threat, but as correction. Karen stumbled back from the window, gasping. Her vision blurred with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Her mouth was dry. The room spun slightly. When she looked again, Avery was gone. The trucks had pulled away. No marks in the street, no tire tracks, no explanation. Just absence, thick and absolute. And in her hallway, without ever opening the door, there was an envelope. She picked it up with trembling hands, opened it, and inside found a single sheet. Not a warning this time, not a threat, but coordinates. A real place. Latitude, longitude. Remote, mountainous, out of state. Beneath them, 4 words in crisp block text. Ask what came before. Karen didn't sleep that night. She packed a bag with nothing but water, a change of clothes, and the notebook with the strange symbols. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She locked her house from the outside, left her phone on the kitchen table, and walked 3 blocks to where the trucks had first appeared. She stood in the exact spot, heart steady now, mind quiet. And when she closed her eyes, she felt the hum return, not in her ears, but beneath her skin. And then, faintly, as if from far beneath the ground, she heard it, roots whispering in frequencies older than language. And they knew her name. Weeks passed, though Karen could no longer measure time the way she once did. Days folded into one another like pages stuck together in a forgotten book, and whatever had once driven her, order, policy, control, felt as distant now as the woman she used to be. She never reached the coordinates. Not physically. Something told her she was never meant to. They weren't a destination. They were a pivot, a key to perception. The more she focused on them, the more she understood. Not just what Avery was, but what Karen had resisted becoming. The truth had never been buried beneath the soil. It had been growing in plain sight, cultivated with patience, precision, and absolute clarity. Avery hadn't defended herself with force because she didn't need to. She had already won before anyone realized there was a contest. One morning, without announcement, Avery reappeared across the street. No trucks, no message, just her, tending the garden as if nothing had happened. Karen watched from her front steps, cradling a lukewarm cup of tea she no longer tasted. Their eyes met once more, and this time there was no tension, no challenge, just quiet acknowledgement. A transaction completed, a boundary accepted. From that moment, Karen understood she was not being erased, only repurposed. Her silence had become soil, her resistance, fertilizer, her presence, a root in the larger system, stabilizing what was to come. And when the neighborhood bloomed weeks later in strange, synchronized color, petals unfurling in hues unseen by most eyes, no one asked questions. No one filed complaints. The plants had claimed their place. So had Avery. So had Karen. And peace, though unfamiliar, settled over the street like pollen in the air.